Hello and welcome to Implementing Zero Trust Architecture, a joint presentation by Arctic IT and Microsoft. This is an encore presentation of material we presented back in October, and it turned out to be our #1 webinar of the year. We wanted to expand our audience to include all of the sectors we serve, including tribal, commercial, state and local government, and the federal government. I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. First up is our own Bill Travitz, Director of Tribal Business at Arctic IT. Bill came to us after serving for years as the IT Director for the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians based in Western North Carolina. Joining Bill, we have not one, but two incredibly smart colleagues from Microsoft. Chuck Ladd, who serves as Security Services Director, and joining Chuck is Brent, a Senior Technology Specialist in Cybersecurity. A few housekeeping items. We will be happy to take any questions you have. Please go ahead and place them in the chat box, and we will be sure to answer them at the end of the presentation. As always, our presentations are being recorded, and you will receive a link to it 24 hours after our presentation. We're giving you an A team of Zero Trust folks, so with that, I will pass the presentation on to Bill.
Thanks very much, Joanne. Appreciate it. And thank you, everybody, for joining us here today at this encore presentation. Glad to have you here and that you're taking time out of your day to learn about this important topic. I wanted to go ahead and talk a little bit about the presentation today. This is our agenda for this presentation. There is a lot of material included here, so we're not going to be reading you slides. There's a lot of leave behind things that you're going to want to take a look at after the presentation. So without further ado, into the actual agenda. We're going to talk briefly about the Arctic IT partnership. I'm going to do an intro into my previous employer, the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, and there's actually a really great case study that Microsoft did on their journey into Zero Trust and the origins of that journey. So we'll put that link in the chat for you. And then we'll dive right into Zero Trust architecture. You know, what is it, what's it look like, and what are the steps to implement it? And I want to make sure that I emphasize here right at the outset that Zero Trust is not something that you switch on today and it's on. It's a journey. There's a way that you approach it, and that's what we're going to try to expose today during this particular presentation. So then we'll talk a little bit about some of the things you'll need to get started, and of course we're going to leave plenty of time at the end for a Q&A session. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the partnership that we have with Microsoft. So we are a Microsoft Gold partner, and as you know, that partner program is, you're probably aware that partner program is about to take a change in April, so the titling will change a little bit. But at the end of the day, we have a very long-standing relationship with Microsoft, and we are a Microsoft shop. That is our core competency. We work in Azure and M365 solutions and work to build workflows, and you can see some of the things that are going on. But one of the things that I really wanted to highlight about our track record here is that we are a security first organization. As you all know, security is a way of life. You have to think about it in every aspect of what you do, whether it's physical process, your IT processes, whatever the case may be. It's really our way of doing things is to think about the security as we build every component of our solutions for our customers. So these are some of the sectors that Arctic IT serves: federal government, state and local, and tribal and government enterprise, which is where I'm focused in my particular position. And we also have practice in commercial business. And this includes everything from managed services to building workflow and Microsoft Dynamics-based solutions for F&O, customer resource management, and then customized applications to include things like point of sale. There's a lot that goes on there, but I just wanted to touch briefly on the fact that we do cover quite a number of practices, even though I'm here speaking to you from the tribal side of things. And this was a slide that I talked about a few moments ago. This link here in the center of the screen is a link to a case study that was actually published by Microsoft. It's on the Microsoft marketing site. You can take a look and read it, but it talks about what happened at the Eastern Band. And the reason I'm covering this is because having been at the Eastern Band for 3 years, we were ransomed not long after I started, which effectively knocked us completely out of business. at the time. And so as a result of that, we were able to take the on-prem architecture that we had, the traditional Active Directory and all of that, and move it into a full M365 Azure implementation. And it was the first one in Indian country that was done. There are others who have followed, but it really informs my understanding of how to use Azure to implement a zero trust architecture. So the link will be in the chat if you want to read that for yourself. It really does do a great job of talking about some of the background and all. So I'll leave that there for you. So let's talk about defining a zero trust architecture. And I'm going to hand this in just a few moments over to Chuck, who's going to really take you into the nitty gritty of zero trust. But I wanted to start with an analogy that I really like to use about how we used to do security and the way we do security today. And the analogy is, if you think of a castle, and the castle has a moat around it and it's got a drawbridge. So the way we used to think about security, and this I know is a dramatic oversimplification for my cybersecurity audience out there, but the way we used to think about security at a high level was you had this wall, this moat, and you kept people out. But once you let them in, you sort of trusted where they went within the network. So if I wanted to go into a specific room in the castle or whatever, you know what? I know who you are. You've been in. So enter social engineering. So now we have the idea of the castle sitting there with the drawbridge up, and I walk up and I say, "Hello, I'm Arthur, King of the Britons," and you say, "Oh, well, you look like Arthur. You got a white robe and you got a crown on, so I'm going to let you inside." But once he's inside, then he has free trust, and you may post a guard outside the room with the crown jewels, but by and large, we let everybody go everywhere. The new modern way of doing it is, imagine that same castle in the moat. If somebody gets to the drawbridge, they have to be authenticated. So not only, King Arthur, do you have to show that you're coming in, but you have to show me your scepter, which is multi-factor authentication, right? So I walk inside, and then what happens? The first thing that happens is the gate guard hands me a golden token, and it says, "This is your unique ID for anywhere you want to go in the castle." So the difference with zero trust is that when I try to enter a room, somebody has to check that token. Yep, he's got the golden token. He's allowed to go in. That's his unique golden token. Once you get inside the room, if you happen to be in the room with the crown jewels, if you reach over to touch the crown jewels, somebody says, "Whoa, wait a minute, let me check that golden token before you touch it." And if you go back and try to touch it again, we check it one more time. So there's a big difference once you're inside the walls as to how zero trust works. So that's my analogy. Hopefully you enjoyed the Monty Python reference there. And I'm going to go ahead and toss it over the wall to Chuck, and he's going to really go into the real definition.
I'm just wondering how many people did get the Monty Python reference, but really quick, I'm not a fan of reading slides, so I'm not really going to read the slide to you. But the thing I want to stress the most, and I'm sure everyone on this call is being hit by every security vendor on the face of the planet, and all of their marketing is geared toward zero trust, and they may be even telling you they're giving you a holistic zero trust solution or a product that will make you zero trust compliant. And my message to all of my customers and everyone that I work with is that zero trust is not a product. Zero trust is an architecture. It's a philosophy. It's how you go about now securing your environment. And the three core principles that Microsoft really lives by with zero trust is never trust, always verify, least privileged access, and assume breach. Let's move to that next slide.
There we go.
And as this builds out, if we start to look at verify explicitly, you don't know what you don't know. And you always want to make security decisions using all available data points, including identity, location, device health, resources, data classification, and anomalies. You need to know the end user and do a continuous assessment. You use least privileged access. You limit the access. Just have just-in-time access to resources, just enough access to any type of resource, and use risk-based adaptive policies to know the health of the user and the device before they access. Now, we're going to go into these a little deeper. And this is really the true digital transformation of security practice is always assume breach, right? We want to minimize the blast radius with micro segmentation, end-to-end encryption, continuous monitoring, and automated threat detection and response. And so as we look at the 6 different pillars down here, Microsoft's principles of verify explicitly, use least privileged access, and assume breach span across all 6 pillars. And I'm going to hand it over to Brent now, the technical specialist, to kind of dig in what that looks like from a Microsoft approach.
Thanks, Chuck.
Yeah.
And as everybody's mentioned before, Microsoft has 6 pillars. Other organizations, other regulations will have 5. A lot of our civilian customers are going to follow 5 pillars, and our defense customers are going to follow 7 pillars. But they're all essentially doing the same thing. So you can see here we've got the 6 pillars all listed: identities, devices, data, apps, and infrastructure and network. But this is all tied together through policy-driven access. So we want to make sure that all our policies are being enforced at the time of access and continuously throughout the session wherever possible. So that whole analogy of Monty Python and the crown jewels, it's not going to just be when you get access to the place where it's stored, but every time you interact with that data. And because of the fact that if we're doing traditional authentication every single time, that's going to get to be too much for most uses, we have risk-based authentication and access rules that we're going to be used to automate that process and make it a little bit more palatable for our end users. And that leads into automated threat detection and response. So we're not just automating the risk-based access, we're also automating our threat detection and our threat response. We want to make sure that we're able to react at the same time or at the same speed as our adversaries. Our adversaries are in the cloud, so their attacks are happening at cloud speed. We need to be able to respond with the same amount of speed. So what we're going to do now is walk through each pillar real quickly. I won't say that identity is necessarily the most important pillar. That might be a little bit too strong, but it is our starting point, and it's the foundation that we build everything else on. Most of the zero trust architecture doesn't mean much without identity, and that's why we make it our first guiding, it's why it aligns so well with our first guiding principle for zero trust, which is to verify our identity explicitly. The identity pillar is also really important because it enables us to enforce that least privileged access paradigm, which was our second principle. And then also it gives us the ability to implement that guiding principle of assuming breach. So we have to segment the network, segment the access, and at every point, not just because I know we talk a lot about network segmentation, but identity segmentation and groups and RBAC are going to be key to all of this. And sorry, RBAC meaning role-based access controls. I don't want to use an acronym that I haven't defined. But moving on from identities to endpoints on our next slide, once an identity has been granted access, the data can flow to and from a variety of resources. We've got employee laptops, mobile devices, IoT devices, and even cloud-hosted servers. And those are all adding up to a pretty massive exposed attack surface. So with a zero trust approach, we secure these devices through centrally enforced policies and monitoring posture. So we're bringing all that data into one place so that we can see everything, we can manage our vulnerabilities, we can enforce device health and patching and compliance. And we're also going to make sure that we protect our data at the endpoints by creating automations so that when we do have a compromise, we're able to contain critical data and not have a huge blast radius. So on the next one, speaking of data, we have our data pillar. Protecting data is always IT's primary focus. This is probably what I would call the why of the pillars. Everything else mostly supports protecting the data. Even when the data leaves our enterprise, we still need to be able to protect it. So it should always be encrypted. Access should still be limited by the principle of least privilege, especially for our most critical data, even after it's left the enterprise and is out in the world. We want our data to be able to protect itself. And in order to do that, we need to have data classification systems in place that don't just rely on humans to do the work. Machine learning is going to give us the ability to automate and the searching and labeling process, which is already going to be laborious even with the machine learning. But if you are looking at a large organization with a significant amount of sensitive data, there's going to be a major lift. So we're able to use that machine learning to speed things up and do that detection across any branding or platform or application. So this isn't just like a Microsoft thing. You're going to want to be able to do that across all of your applications. And I know Bill will have more to say about this, but as I already said, this is going to be a big one. And he's going to talk through with the Eastern Band of Cherokee and how they did things there. It's non-trivial for most people. So our applications are similar to our endpoints in the fact that it's an interface used to consume data. However, the difference here is that the hardware and supporting architectures and even users are mostly abstracted away. We're talking about applications and APIs that require the zero trust controls to be limiting our in-app permissions, access, monitor for abnormal behaviors, and we're also validating secure configuration options from the endpoint. And that's going to give us what we need to lock down the user access to that application. And we're going to do that with a cloud application security broker, or a CASB. Not only will we be able to accomplish the things that I've already mentioned, but we'll also be able to discover our shadow IT or unsanctioned applications our users are going out and accessing and sharing data through. And we can regulate which apps are going to be or can be used, and then how the users can use them. So with our CASB, we're going to want to make sure that we have the granularity to make all those decisions in the controls. Moving on, we've got our infrastructure pillar. All of the infrastructure resources, or servers, cloud-based VMs, and so on, they face potential threats. And the zero trust paradigm assesses for, or we're going to want to build the ability to assess for version, configuration, accesses to hardened defenses, and using our telemetry to detect attacks and anomalies, and automatically blocking and flagging risks and taking protective actions. In order to do all of that, we need to have a central pane of glass that gives us coverage across all of our cloud assets, regardless of which cloud they're in. The thing that enables that in the end is having a good inventory of our environment. I think for a lot of organizations, I know most of the ones that I've been in, there's the infrastructure that you know you have, and then the infrastructure that's just sort of organically grown and cropped up through testing or old products, or you name it, whether it's an old website, an old application, or even unsanctioned, unapproved budget spends that happened in 2009. These are all going to be things that end up cropping up as security vulnerabilities in our infrastructure if we're not making sure to do a full detection of our whole inventory. So just like with data, labeling is the big lift. With infrastructure, inventory is the big lift. And lastly, all of our data is accessed over our network infrastructure at some point. So this one might feel like it's a little bit similar to infrastructure, but the focus here is going to be on improving visibility and preventing attackers from moving laterally by segmenting our networks and making sure that we have real-time threat protection, and that those network connections are going to be encrypted end-to-end, and that we're monitoring that traffic and making sure that everything looks normal. We do also want to make sure that we can spin our infrastructure back up in case of an incident, because we're always assuming breach, right? So if we lose everything, having things like Azure Blueprints, infrastructure as code setups allows us to get back to square one really easily in case that we have to go through and do a recovery. So here's my final slide before I hand back to Chuck. So to wrap up, what is zero trust? I would put it in one sentence as zero trust is the idea that every transaction in the digital state is going to begin with the verification of an entity's identity, and it's going to be limited by the principle of least privilege, and it's going to be done in a way that allows for secure operation in the middle of a breach. So I feel like that lines back right with what Bill and Chuck have both said so far. It's not a set of products. It's a way for us to think about how we architect our enterprise and secure our data. I wish there was an easy button, but there isn't, which means we have to be prepared to cut this up into manageable pieces and have a zero trust roadmap with plenty of runway, because there will be snags, because zero trust is our heading rather than the destination. There is no zero trusted, as a lot of us like to say. But with that, Chuck.
Yeah, fantastic. Go ahead, Bill, to the next slide. Yeah, so everything that we've covered up to this point has really been about a Microsoft holistic approach to building out zero trust architectures inside of your environment. And there are probably attendees on the call right now that are thinking, we approach security from a best of breed type motion, right? So you're looking at the Gartner Magic Quadrants, you're looking at the Forrester Wave reporting, and you're buying all these disparate security products and trying to stitch them together. And so at Microsoft, we believe the more security products that you have from different vendors, the more vulnerable you really are, right? The more training that your resources need to have to go out and do an investigation, to actually lock down the environment. And so building on top of that mentality, in late 2021, we commissioned the Forrester Consulting Group to go out and do a total economic impact study of an organization that moved forward with using a pure play Microsoft architecture. Now, these numbers will be different for every organization. Not everyone's going to see a $11.6 million return. It depends on the size of your organization. But you're definitely going to see it in the ballpark of 90 to 92% return on investment. You're going to see your risk, right, greatly reduced, and you're going to see the breach risk going down by 50%. You're going to see those phone calls coming in from your end users to the help desk going down because of the EDR technology that's being deployed to the desktops. This study is widely available, can be downloaded from www.microsoft.com/security. I recommend you download it, look at it, and I do want to comment on the best of breed statement from me. If you look at the Gartner Magic Quadrants, you will see that Microsoft security products are leaders in most categories. And so not only is Microsoft a platform, but also it's a platform full of best of breed solutions. So definitely download the study, see where you can benefit from moving forward with a Microsoft pure play solution. And at this time, I'm going to hand it back to Bill to dig deeper into the Eastern Band.
Yes, thank you so much, Chuck and Brent, for all that information. So let me frame this up for you where we're about to go. So as we said, zero trust is a journey, right? So it's going to take some time. I was at the Eastern Band for 3 years, and we were still implementing zero trust when I left after 3 years, and the actual incident occurred about 90 days into my tenure there, which pretty much flattened us. It put us on our backs. So, and that includes, if you think about the Eastern Band as a small municipality with the complexity of like a Charlotte, North Carolina, in terms of all the programs that are delivered, police, EMS, 911 dispatch, highway department, public health and human services, education. You think of it, there's a service that's offered for it, and all of that went down during this ransom. So the decision that we took at the time was we're going from on-prem and we're going all in. Now, fortunately for us at the time, we were already an E5 licensed shop, meaning the enterprise level 5 licensing. for Microsoft, which includes all of the tools that you would need to implement zero trust architecture, save the ones that are specific to Azure compute resources. So I'm going to just go ahead and start talking into the slides here. So what I did was I divided this into 5 steps, and think of this as macro level steps that you might want to take to implement a zero trust architecture. And how do you take this gigantic ball of technologies and principles and concepts, and then all of your existing production environment, how do you get there? You know, what are the steps that you want to take? So the first one, and I also put out the caveat that some of these are a bit interchangeable, but I had to put a number on them somewhere. So I'll highlight that as I go through the slides. But the first thing is getting into an identity-centric mindset. So that's super important. And in the analogy that I gave of having the person with their golden token presenting that golden token every time they wanted to touch the king's crown, that's how identity-centric mindset works, or an identity-centric security architecture. In the old days, we were more device-centric. Devices have identities too, which Brent alluded to in his, in his bit of the presentation. But identity is the key thing that you got to focus on first, and it's the low-hanging fruit as far as most bang for the buck when you implement it to really make your security posture better. And so there is a link here. It's a bit.ly link, and this actually goes to a Microsoft site, which will take you to security evaluation. So this was presented this year at Ignite. It was launched then, and that particular survey will allow you to, at a 10,000-foot level, go through and answer questions, and it's going to identify to you where you are in your zero trust architecture. So I encourage everybody to follow that link. It really will help you assess your existing security posture, which is point number 1. You got to know where you are before you know where you're going. And one of the silver linings in the process that we had to endure was that it did knock everything out of business. So we had the slate to start over. And I'll comment a little bit about some of the financial savings that we made a little bit later in the presentation. But I wouldn't wish that on anybody. And I understand that everybody's got their own priorities in terms of keeping their production environments up. But again, you got to start here, assessing your security posture. All right, second point, building a security operations team. So I can feel everybody cringing. I know I would have in my chair as director, but building a security operations team can mean many flavors of it. It can be an internally built thing where you have your own 24/7 staff, or you can hybridize it by either outsourcing that or relying on Microsoft tools and so on and so forth. So building that team and then having a SIEM like Sentinel to be able to collect every piece of actionable data, including data that's in SaaS apps that is outside of your environment. So you have this sort of one-stop pane of glass. But the really cool part about it is once you get all this implemented is that the artificial intelligence that's built into it really starts to surface things so that you don't have to have 20 sets of eyes staring at 20 screens monitoring every alert. And we all know about alert fatigue. These you can use the tools within Sentinel to build really high quality actionable alerts as to what's going on. And when you start to automate your data loss prevention and things like that, it can actually come up and tell you, well, we stopped somebody from exfiltrating your entire source code library, rather than you having to take an action on it. So it really shifts you from that reactive mode into a proactive mode. Third major step, prioritize the security and identities of devices and apps. So this goes back to the first point about identity. And 2 and 3, honestly, point 2 and point 3 really have to happen more or less simultaneously. Your security operations team has to be involved in every single decision that's made. Remember, we said think security first. So they have to be involved in all these decisions about the things that you can do in terms of implementing Endpoint Manager, as Brent said, to lock down and manage those endpoints to make sure that you know what they're doing, you know that they're compliant when they attach to your network, and you have a way to very quickly remediate if you do have a blast. And again, blast radius is key in all of this. If I lose one device and I can wipe it instantaneously and put it back on the network, that's good. What I don't want is it to have that east-west trust relationship that allows it to cross from server to device to device to device, which is exactly how we got had in our ransomware attack. So important here is switching to that north-south identity verification, where everything gets checked every time an asset is touched, that the token comes with it and says this person is valid to be able to touch this resource. So that's number 3. Let's move on. All right, here's your, as Brent alluded to earlier, this is your heavy lift, data governance. And there are tools that you can use built in within Azure to identify things like HIPAA data and PII and things like that. So you can run tools to classify and harden those data assets. But at some point, you have to get with your stakeholder bodies and with your whoever you're serving as your end customer to say, what's important to you? What's the crown jewels and what's public data? So I always use the example that the Cherokee Department of Transportation has a completely different set of priorities about data security than Public Health and Human Services does. So that's what makes it such a heavy lift. If your organization is complex, you're going to have to set those classifications. But the reward at the end of all this, once you've established that data governance and you start to have automated tools and AI is looking at the movement and contact with that data, you can automate things like I mentioned earlier. Somebody's trying to exfiltrate your entire source code library. You can stop it in its tracks and then tell somebody, which is a completely different way than seeing the alert and going, oh my God, what do we do? Where'd it go? So that's what's really important about this. And there's a lot that goes into this. And that's why I keep saying it's a journey. Last point is continuously optimize. And yeah, 5, it's at the end of this process, but you have to be continuously optimizing your processes. The first time you do something, you're not going to be able to implement it. So let's say you're doing MFA. You may not be able to put unequivocal enforcement of it on because of some assets that you have on your network that just break if you do that. So you have to continuously look at every step you take in the zero trust architecture and go back and reevaluate where you are in that process and how do you make it better. The other thing that happened, specifically in the case that I'm referring to, is that the tools continue to improve. So what I was able to implement on day 1 is much less effective than what I could implement in a certain area on day, on the 3rd year. So that's why this particular part of the process is so incredibly important. All right, so how do you get started? It sounds like a lot, it's overwhelming, but you got to just start with, as Brent said, start with the things that are easy, or the things that are the low-hanging fruit that are going to give you the bang for the buck. And as Brent indicated, everything hangs on identity and zero trust. So you're going to have to start in that area and then continue to work out. So this top point here, I can't say enough about this. Do not wait to find the true value of your data from a breach. And I did read you that bullet on the slide, but I want to say that again. It is so incredibly important. In the case of, in the case that I was familiar with, our 911 dispatch center was down for 36 hours because of a ransomware attack. And it actually resulted in a response being delayed by 18 minutes where a person lost their life. So it can be life and death. It really depends on your situation, but start now, start today, and really go look at it and evaluate it. There's the link for the security posture thing. And then the other thing that I think is incredibly important, and Arctic IT would love to be your partner in this, but partner with somebody who really understands how to use the product tools to implement these concepts within your Microsoft stack. So I can't say enough about that. We had a Microsoft as a direct partner, which was humongously expensive. No offense, you guys, but but having that partner on site to be able to walk us through the steps and make sure that we were implementing really was invaluable in getting to that zero trust posture. So I think that brings us to the end of the presentation. So at this point, I did want to make just that final comment about the finances. You can't afford not to do this, folks. So when I look at, as the director of IT, when I looked at the numbers, we were already paying for E5 licensing, but we weren't using but a tiny fraction. Our Exchange Online was it. But I was already paying that amount of money to have that licensing. And so I added some Azure spend for building up virtual servers for some of the legacy apps that we had to microsegment into the Azure cloud rather than having an on-prem server. But I was already spending most of that money anyway. And what I lost was the power consumption, the technology refresh, the employee overhead to keep servers up to date. We had 130 virtual machines that all had to be updated. That all went away. It's all that stuff just happens magically in the Azure Fabric. So it really is a gigantic, for us, it was a gigantic cost savings. And I got to take those human assets in IT and redeploy them to something more valuable, like solving somebody's problem. So I can't say enough about it. It really is important. So without any further gassing on, I'm going to go ahead and bring Joanne back in, and I'm sure she's been monitoring the questions in the chat.
Okay, thank you guys. That was an excellent presentation. And yes, we had a couple questions come in. So related to the Microsoft approach, the first question was, can you work on these 6 items in any order, or is there a specific order you should follow to reach the end goal?
I'll go ahead and start, and I think Brent's got something he wants to say, judging by him putting his hand up there. You can do a lot of the things, but simultaneously, and you have to kind of look at what's important. But I got to be honest with you, if you don't start with tackling identity and securing your devices, you're going to have these gigantic holes in your network architecture that you won't really have the foundation to be able to build the rest of it on top of, specifically data governance, microsegmentation. Brent, please feel free to jump in here.
Yeah, I don't know if I could say it better. Like that is the place where you start. There are things that you can do simultaneously, but the ability to do those things simultaneously comes from your foundation built on your identity. So that's the first thing you need to tackle.
And that's exactly how we tackled it at the Eastern Band. It was, we started with identity, we got MFA up and running, which again, that is low-hanging fruit right there, folks. That has huge bang for the buck in terms of securing your network. And then working on using, it used to be called Intune, but now it's called Microsoft Endpoint Manager, but building out that architecture so that I can know what's on those devices, I can deploy software to those devices, I can limit the software that's deployed to the devices, and it happens for iOS, Android, and Microsoft Windows.
Yeah, and just-in-time access is also huge, especially for admins. If you can get a lot of, because I know there are solutions that if you've grown up in IT, we've had for a long time, in terms of like having like a lockbox for admin credentials and things like that. We've moved on beyond, just hashing all of our passwords and putting them in one spot, and you reach in, open it up, and like use a password to the point where we're able to manage that all via our identity structure, and we don't need to pass passwords around. And I think that's a huge win for dealing with insider threat, or for outside attackers who are leveraging insider threats. It's because at that point, you can't just hand somebody your password. It's a permission, it's a time-based thing. So
yeah, and we implemented that at the Eastern Band, just-in-time elevation, and we actually subdivided it into groups. So what service desk needed versus what a senior sysadmin needed were completely different sets of securities. So rather than handing out global admin to everybody, we limited those sets and called them super groups. And then you had to elevate, you had to put in a request, it had to be peer authorized, and then it had a time limit. So the zero persistent admin is one of the key principles within the zero trust architecture. So everybody remembers the old hard coded password that's in every copy of SQL Server from days of old. Those things don't exist because you use what's called a managed identity. which is the modern equivalent of sort of a well-known, well-authenticated sysadmin password. One of the ways that we were breached was by the compromise of the sysadmin password. And so once they had that, they had east-west trust across the entire network, and it took less than an hour to completely debilitate 1,300 workstations and 130 servers.
Okay, great, thank you. Another question that came in: is there grant funding available to help tribes or nonprofit organizations achieve zero trust?
Yes, short answer is yes. You can get, so there's a whole bunch of monies that came out both with the COVID response, and then there's a bunch of infrastructure monies that are out there. And I'm sorry that I'm not going to be able to speak to specific examples, but for example, one of the things that we did while I was with the Eastern Band was to replace all of our endpoints with, with basically Surface devices. I bought 981 Surface devices using CARES Act money because it was able to be justified based upon the fact that I was creating a mobile workforce that could be used. They could use them at home and didn't have to come into the office. Thus, the hook to COVID. But you have to look at what's out there. We leveraged CARES, ARPA, and then we were also looking at some of the NTIA related infrastructure funds. That's less zero trust, but short answer, yes. And one of the things that we're working on at Arctic IT is partnering with, we've got a vendor we're partnering with to help be able to go look for these things. So stay tuned. There should be announcements on that sometime soon.
Okay, great. We don't have any other questions. Bill, Chuck, and Brent, do you want to add anything before we close out?
I don't think so, no. Sorry.
No, I was just going to ask Chuck to comment on the whole digital landscape. You made a comment in our run through talking about
digital transformation.
Yeah, digital transformation and how implementing an architecture over a set of products. There are products that solve the need. I don't know. Anyway, if you can just kind of sort of comment on that, that would probably be a good closer.
Yeah, so when I say digital transformation, I think about the journey that a lot of organizations have embarked on even 5 to 10 years ago, where they moved from on-premise technologies to cloud-based technologies, right? So if we think about the shift from Exchange that used to be on-premise to Exchange Online, or SharePoint that was deployed on-premise, or old style file shares that are all being moved to the cloud, and being able to take advantage of, security controls that are widely available on cloud-based solutions. And so as we start to talk about the modernization of security, we're moving into a cloud-based arena where you're using technologies that are backed by telemetry that's being gathered in the cloud, and AI that's parsing out and developing indicators of compromise and indicators of attack, and being able to do real-time detection. And also, if we talk about digital transformation security, XDR, doing auto remediation on the endpoint. So a lot of these organizations don't have enough eyes to put on glass, right? They can't stare at that monitor and wait for that event to happen to go out there, triage, and take care of it. We need tools that can do self-healing on the endpoint. So again, you've heard a few times, minimizing the blast radius. And also, as adopting, when we talk about continuous assessment of the identity, we're talking about Azure Active Directory and being able to, continuously assess that user session. And if they're going out and they're hitting a high business impact application or a medium business application, they may need to be re-challenged. There may have been a change in their session, right? Their desktop may have become compromised. Something may have happened to the end user to where they're now a risky user. And so these are continuous, real, adaptive type solutions to help organizations be secure. And that's what I mean by digital transformation in the security arena.
Thank you, Chuck. So I wanted to add one thing, just a philosophy that we followed when I was with the Eastern Band. when we started embarking on a zero trust journey, we made a conscious decision to use only the Microsoft tools unless there was a compelling reason not to. And by and large, that strategy was successful. The reason for that is when you start buying third-party security products, you've got supply chain potential issues, you've got a complete understanding of another product that maybe have some legacy stuff inside of it that hasn't been, they haven't found the bug yet, but someday they will. So we really tried to stay in the Microsoft organization, and then really we built a security process which evaluates very strongly any vendor that we consider bringing in for a SaaS app, including how do they do their software engineering within the organization, how do they secure their internal data, which you would have to mostly sign an NDA for, but by verifying how they do business, you get a really good feel for whether they're security focused and security first as a vendor to you. And then, of course, because your identity provider, Azure Active Directory, is the sole authority about whether you belong to this organization or not, I can then pass SAML tokens out to things like ServiceNow or Ava Security, which was our surveillance and security system, all SaaS apps, but all relying on our identity provider to be the authority as to who was a member of the Eastern Band of Cherokee's team.
In building on top of that, Bill, and I'm sorry to keep the conversation going, and you just listed out SaaS apps, right, and federating with SaaS apps. And I'm sure we're talking to organizations right now on this call that still have on-premise applications. And you ask yourself, how can I put a modern identity in front of that application? And we do have technologies built into Azure Active Directory that you could stand up in front of legacy applications to take advantage of these adaptive tools that are available in Azure Active Directory. So legacy apps shouldn't stop you from adopting a modern type architecture.
I totally agree. And so for example, with the environment that we had they had an ERP system which was built on .NET. It's a legacy app. It required a copy of standard Active Directory, but we were able to use the concept of microsegmentation to put that into a container in virtual Azure servers, and then allow Azure AD to be the identity authority. And then only within that community of people needing to use those ERP screens would you have to have that AD. But again, minimizing blast radius. It couldn't get out of that container and go over and hit other legacy solutions that we had built up.
Yeah. I don't have anything to add. Great conversation.
Yes. Thank you, guys. Excellent presentation. And I really want to thank everybody for joining us. Please remember this presentation is being recorded and you will receive a link to it shortly after the webinar ends. So with that, I'm going to give everybody back about 10 minutes of their day. And again, thank you for joining us. Have a great day.
Thanks for coming, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Have a good day.